Somewhere beneath the mountains of central Iran, the ground gave way. Not from an earthquake, not from erosion, from war. For months now, the world has been watching satellite photos of Iran's missile infrastructure. Grainy black and white images that show craters, collapsed tunnel mouths, and buried entrances where some of the Islamic Republic's most important weapons facilities used to stand wide open. And this week, one of those images has triggered a new wave of alarm inside Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps, because it confirms something officials in Tehran have been trying to downplay for weeks. The base isn't just damaged. Structurally, parts of it have collapsed. If you've been following this channel, you know this war didn't start yesterday. It didn't even start this year. This is the latest chapter in a conflict that ignited back in June 2025 with the 12-day war, reignited in February 2026 after a joint U.S.-Israeli operation killed Iran's supreme leader and has now stretched past the 140-day mark of open military exchanges across the Gulf. But what's happening right now, this week, is different, because we are talking about the collapse of the crown jewel of Iran's missile program. The facility at the center of this story is known as the Ahmad Kazemi complex, located near Najafabad in central Iran. If that name doesn't mean anything to you yet, here's why it should. Analysts at the Nuclear Threat Initiative have described this exact site as Iran's largest missile assembly and production facility, the place where solid and liquid fuel missiles, including Shahab series ballistic missiles and Chinese-derived Silkworm and M-class cruise missiles, are built, fueled, and prepared for launch. This isn't a storage depot. This is the factory floor of Iran's entire ballistic missile deterrent. And now, side by side, satellite. Comparisons, taken before the original 2024 strikes, and again after subsequent strikes into December 2025 and into this year, show that large sections of that base have been destroyed. Tunnel systems that once allowed missile components to move underground, out of sight of Western intelligence, are now caved in. Access roads that led into the mountain are gone, replaced by craters and rubble fields visible from space. Here's the twist that makes this story even bigger than a single strike. For months, U.S. and Israeli officials have quietly admitted something uncomfortable. Multiple of these bombing runs didn't fully destroy Iran's missile bases, they just collapsed the entrances. The weapon stockpiles buried deep inside the mountains, according to reporting from the Wall Street Journal, were often left completely untouched. Sealed shut, yes. Destroyed, no. Which means the real question driving this video isn't, is the base gone? It's, what's still down there and how fast can Iran dig it back out? Because here's what's been happening in the shadows while the world was focused on headline strikes. Satellite imagery from Planet Labs and Airbus has repeatedly caught Iran doing exactly what you'd expect. And engineering and construction-obsessed regime to do after a collapse, excavating. At a missile base near Dezful in southwestern Iran, imagery from earlier this year showed entrances buried by airstrikes. Just months later, new imagery showed those same entrances freshly redug, with a paved access road already restored. The same pattern showed up at a base near Kermanshah in western Iran, and again near Kangavar, a site where two tunnel entrances and their connecting road had been hit and were later found completely rebuilt, repaved, and reopened. So when we say Iran's largest missile base just collapsed, we're not talking about a single dramatic implosion caught on a live stream. We're talking about the slow-motion unraveling of Iran's deep underground missile infrastructure. A collapse that started with airstrikes, is being partially reversed by Iranian engineers working around the clock, and is now colliding head-on with a U.S. administration that is talking openly about ending this once and for all, because while Iran has been digging, Washington has been escalating. Just this week, President Trump told Israeli media he is considering what he called a massive attack, larger than the previous named, operations in this war against Iran. He said no final decision had been made, no new orders had been issued, but he was, in his words, close. And he said if the U.S. moved, Israel would join within 2 minutes if asked. That's the environment this collapsed missile base exists in right now. Not an isolated incident, a single visible fracture point in a war that both sides are actively deciding whether to make dramatically, catastrophically bigger. And the IRGC knows it, which is why, in the hours and days after the extent of the damage became clear, Revolutionary Guard commanders didn't stay quiet. They scrambled. Publicly, loudly, and across an entire region. Strikes hit Kuwait. Strikes hit Jordan. Air defenses lit up over Erbil. A Kuwaiti telecommunications tower was hit as declared retaliation for a U.S. strike on Iranian telecom infrastructure. Iran's army spokesperson went on record saying retaliatory attacks would continue as long as U.S. strikes on Iranian infrastructure continue. The foreign minister invoked the phrase, an eye for an eye. This is what a cornered missile program looks like when its flagship facility takes a body blow it can't fully hide. In the next 3 sections, we're going to break down exactly what this base was, why losing it matters more than almost any other target in this war, how the IRGC has responded, across 5 different countries in the last 72 hours, and where this war is realistically headed next, including the possibility that we are about to watch the biggest single escalation of the entire conflict. Stay with me, because what happens at this one collapsed mountain complex may end up shaping the next phase of the entire US-Iran war. To understand why this collapse matters so much, you need to understand what the Ahmad Kazemi complex actually is, and why Iran built it the way it did in the first place. This facility dates back to the late 1980s, constructed with direct assistance from North Korea and China during the Iran-Iraq War era, when Tehran was racing to build a domestic missile production capability it could not otherwise buy on the open market. Decades later, it had grown into what independent nuclear and missile proliferation researchers now consider Iran's single largest missile assembly and production site, a sprawling underground and surface complex where solid fuel and liquid fuel missile lines operate side by side. Why underground? Because Iran learned early that dispersed, buried infrastructure was the only way to protect a missile program from an adversary with total air superiority. Israel and the US have, for years, held uncontested control of the skies over Iran whenever they choose to exercise it. Iran cannot outbuild that advantage with anti-air defenses alone. So instead, it built downward, carving assembly lines, fueling stations, and storage galleries into mountainsides, connected by tunnel networks designed to survive exactly the kind of bombing campaign now underway. That strategy worked for years. It's part of why, even after the original 12-day war in mid-2025, Iran's missile production didn't grind to a halt, because so much of the actual manufacturing and storage infrastructure survived below ground, even when surface buildings were leveled. But strategy built for one era of warfare doesn't automatically survive the next one. And what's changed in 2026 is persistence. This isn't a single 12-day war anymore. This is a rolling campaign that is now past day 147, with strike waves hitting Iranian coastal defense sites, command centers, air defense installations, and underground weapons storage on a near-weekly basis. CENTCOM has run daylight raids, a notable shift from the nighttime-only strikes of the original war, including a documented 90-minute morning wave against coastal defense and cruise missile sites, followed by additional waves the same day against command infrastructure. When you hit the same geological structures repeatedly, over months rather than once, over 12 days, you get cumulative structural damage that a single strike package was never designed to inflict. Tunnels that survived one hit start to fail after the 4th or 5th. That's the mechanism behind this collapse. It's not that the US or Israel found some new bunker-busting miracle weapon this month. It's that repeated strikes, over a period of many months, have done what a single campaign couldn't. They have fatigued the rock, cracked the reinforced entrances, and, in some sections, brought the tunnel systems down entirely. And here's where the story gets darker for Iran's war planners. The Wall Street Journal's reporting, based on satellite imagery from Planet, Labs and Airbus, revealed an uncomfortable truth on both sides of this conflict. Many of the successful strikes against Iranian missile bases only ever collapsed the surface-level entrances. The actual missile stockpiles, the fuel, the components, the assembled weapons, sat untouched deep inside, buried, but intact, waiting. That means Iran's response to these strikes hasn't been to abandon damaged sites. It's been to dig them back out. At Desful, imagery showed buried entrances, followed months later by fresh excavation and a newly paved access road. At Kermanshah, the same pattern. At Kangavar, a site that had 2 tunnel entrances and an access road destroyed by airstrikes, had, by the time follow-up satellite imagery was captured, been fully repaved and reopened. Construction crews working in the open, apparently unafraid of drawing another strike, or perhaps betting that reconstruction itself wasn't yet a targetable offense. This is the core tension defining the missile base phase of this war. The US and Israel keep collapsing entrances. Iran keeps reopening them. It's trench warfare, except the trenches are hundreds of feet underground and made of solid rock. So why is this particular collapse, at Iran's largest and most symbolically important complex, different from the dozens of other site strikes we've cataloged over the past year? Because of scale and because of sequencing, this is not a secondary depot. This is the facility NTI analysts specifically flagged as Iran's biggest missile assembly and production site. If Iran loses the ability to assemble new missiles at the rate this facility was designed for, that's not a tactical setback, that's a strategic bottleneck. Iran can dig out old stockpiles. It cannot instantly rebuild an assembly line for building new ones. And the timing matters too. This collapse is becoming clear at the exact moment President Trump is publicly weighing a massive attack, larger than any previous named operation in this war. And at a moment when U.S.-Saudi diplomacy has taken a dramatic turn, Washington just signed a 30-year civil nuclear cooperation agreement with Saudi Arabia that reportedly includes a U.S.-operated enrichment facility on Saudi soil, a stunning reversal of decades of American non-proliferation policy, happening in the middle of a war that was originally sparked by Iranian uranium enrichment in the first place. Put those pieces together, and you get a picture of a regime watching its most important weapons factory crumble underground, while its primary adversary talks openly about the biggest strike of the war, and while regional dynamics shift in ways that leave Tehran more isolated than at almost any point in this conflict. Which brings us to what the IRGC actually did about it. Because a cornered missile program with a collapsing flagship base doesn't sit still, it scrambles. And in the next section, we're going deep into exactly how, across 5 different countries in less than 3 days, when your largest missile facility takes structural damage this severe, you don't respond quietly. You respond everywhere, all at once, to prove to your own population and to your enemies that the capability isn't gone. That's exactly what the IRGC did. In the span of roughly 72 hours, Revolutionary Guard forces and allied elements launched or claimed strikes across at least 5 separate fronts: Kuwait, Jordan, Iraq's airspace near Erbil, Bahrain, and continuing operations against the naval blockade in the Strait of Hormuz. This wasn't a single retaliatory gesture. It was a deliberate wide-radius show of force designed to broadcast one message: hitting our missile infrastructure does not stop our missile infrastructure. Start with Kuwait. The IRGC publicly claimed it had attacked and destroyed a large warehouse of military equipment, a Patriot missile defense system, and a hangar of American MQ-9 drones at Ali al-Salam Air Base. Separately, Iranian forces claimed responsibility for striking a Kuwaiti telecommunications tower, explicitly framing it as retaliation for earlier U.S. strikes on Iranian telecom infrastructure. In a direct statement addressed to the Kuwaiti public, not just the Kuwaiti government, the IRGC insisted that the United States, not Iran, had violated Kuwaiti sovereignty by operating strike missions from its soil. That's a messaging strategy as much as a military one. Iran is trying to separate the Kuwaiti population from its own government's alignment with Washington. Move to Jordan. IRGC forces claimed strikes on a THAAD missile defense radar, a Patriot battery, and a C-RAM counter-rocket radar system, all high-value air defense assets. The exact kind of infrastructure that would need to be degraded if Iran wanted to open a corridor for follow-on missile strikes deeper into U.S.-aligned territory. Jordan's own defense ministry confirmed it intercepted 5 missiles near Al-Azraq during this window, and separately, in the days just before, Jordan had recorded its highest single-night interception count of the entire July cycle, 10 Iranian missiles in one night. The IRGC also claimed, without independent confirmation, that it had destroyed U.S. aircraft at Jordan's Azraq Air Base, and Iranian messaging explicitly urged Jordanian citizens to take action against U.S. troops stationed in their country. That's an escalation in rhetoric, not just kinetic action, an attempt to turn local populations into leverage. Then there's the airspace over Erbil in Iraqi Kurdistan, where air defenses intercepted 6 drones on the morning of July 24th alone, an incident serious enough to briefly shut down the airport. Whether these drones were IRGC launched directly or routed through allied militia networks in Iraq, the pattern fits. Widen the geographic footprint of retaliation so that no single country feels safe hosting U.S. assets, and so that U.S. commanders have to defend an ever-expanding perimeter instead of concentrating resources. Bahrain saw its own wave days earlier, with the IRGC claiming strikes on several U.S. bases and a data center, and Bahraini forces confirming they intercepted multiple incoming attacks. And out in the water, the blockade grinds on. The Strait of Hormuz remains functionally closed to Western-aligned commercial shipping, with maritime intelligence firms confirming, essentially, no Western allied transits for weeks at a stretch. Iran's self-declared Persian Gulf Strait Authority has reportedly been charging commercial vessels toll fees of up to $2 million per transit, payable in Chinese yuan, Bitcoin, or USDT, a detail that tells you everything about how thoroughly this conflict has reshaped regional shipping economics and how deliberately Iran is trying to build financial leverage out of military control of a choke point. Iran's own coastline, meanwhile, hasn't been spared while all this outward retaliation was happening. A U.S. missile strike-damaged part of an IRGC naval base at Zabakanar on Iran's Caspian coast, with a provincial official confirming equipment damage but no reported casualties, and attacks on Iranian infrastructure elsewhere, including strikes that destroyed a desalination plant intake station near Jask, cutting drinking water to roughly 10,000 people across 20 villages, show that this war's target list has expanded well past pure military infrastructure into dual-use civilian systems on both sides. Kuwaiti power and desalination facilities have similarly come under Iranian fire, injuring firefighters and workers in the process. What ties all of this together is a single strategic logic. When the IRGC's crown jewel missile base shows visible signs of structural collapse, the leadership's answer isn't to retreat and rebuild quietly. It's to demonstrate loudly across multiple borders, against multiple categories of target, that Iran still has reach. Air defense radars, telecom towers, drone hangars, desalination plants, shipping lanes. This is a regime trying to prove that even a wounded missile program can still make the entire region feel the war. The open question is whether that strategy is actually working, or whether it's accelerating the very outcome Iran is trying to avoid, a far larger US and Israeli response. Because on the other side of this exchange, Washington isn't just absorbing these hits quietly either. And that's where we go next. What Trump's massive attack comments actually mean, why the Saudi nuclear deal timing is not a coincidence, and what the realistic paths forward look like from here. So where does this actually go from here? Let's walk through the realistic paths, because this is the part everyone skips past to get to the dramatic thumbnail moment. And it's the part that actually matters most. Path 1. Full-scale escalation. This is the scenario Trump himself put on the table this week, telling Israeli media he's considering a massive attack, larger than any prior named operation in this war, while stressing no final decision has been made and no new orders issued yet. He added that the US could act alone, but that Israel would join within 2 minutes if asked, a detail meant to signal both readiness and coordination. If this path is chosen, the collapsed Ahmed Kazemi complex becomes not the end of a strike campaign against Iran's missile infrastructure, but the opening chapter of a far more comprehensive one, potentially targeting the excavation and rebuilding efforts themselves at Dezful, Kermanshah, and Kangavar, precisely to prevent Iran from doing what it's done every time before, quietly redigging. That's a meaningful shift in targeting logic worth sitting with. If US and Israeli planners have learned that collapsing entrances alone doesn't stop reconstruction, the next phase of any expanded campaign is likely to specifically target reconstruction equipment, engineering, personnel, and access infrastructure, turning this into an attritional campaign, not just against missiles, but against Iran's capacity to rebuild missile infrastructure at all. That's a much longer, much more resource-intensive war than a single decapitating strike. Path 2. Negotiated de-escalation. It's easy to forget, amid all this military reporting, the diplomatic tracks have not fully closed. Iranian hardline media have been signaling a tougher public stance toward Washington, even as Trump has separately said negotiations are progressing and that a deal may still be within reach. Those two signals, hardline domestic rhetoric and quiet diplomatic optimism, aren't necessarily contradictory. They're consistent with a regime trying to project strength to its own IRGC base and population, while its actual negotiators explore an off-ramp behind closed doors. Iran's posture toward Saudi Arabia supports this reading too. Tehran has noticeably restrained its strike intensity against Saudi targets compared to other regional US allies, reportedly even exploring a mutual non-aggression arrangement with Riyadh at points during the war. A regime genuinely committed to all-out regional war doesn't selectively de-escalate against one of its most strategically important neighbors. Path 3, and this is arguably the most likely near-term outcome based on the pattern of the last 147 days, is exactly what we're seeing right now. Sustained, grinding, multi-front attrition without a single decisive knockout blow from either side. Strikes on missile bases, Iranian excavation and rebuilding, retaliatory strikes on Gulf air defense assets, interceptions in Jordan, Kuwait, Bahrain, blockade tolls in the Strait of Hormuz, damage to civilian infrastructure on both sides. This is a war of exhaustion, not a war of single dramatic turning points, and the collapsed missile base, as significant as it is, fits into that pattern rather than breaking it. What makes this particular moment worth watching closely, though, is the convergence of factors happening. Simultaneously, you have the structural collapse of Iran's largest missile production facility. You have a US president publicly floating the largest strike of the war. You have a landmark, policy-reversing nuclear cooperation agreement between the US and Saudi Arabia, including reported US-operated enrichment capability on Saudi soil, signed in the middle of a war that began, in no small part, over Iranian enrichment activity. And you have Iran's own military spokesperson going on record saying retaliatory attacks will continue for as long as US strikes on Iranian infrastructure continue, with the foreign minister invoking an eye for an eye language publicly. None of those signals alone would be decisive. Together, they describe a system under significant strain where every actor is simultaneously escalating rhetoric, testing military options, and, quietly, in Iran's case, keeping a diplomatic door cracked open just in case. The honest answer, if you're asking whether this is the moment the war fundamentally changes shape, is we don't know yet, and neither likely does Washington, which is precisely why no final decision has been made, is the operative phrase from the highest levels of the US government right now. What we do know is that Iran's largest missile base sustaining structural collapse removes a meaningful piece of its long-term missile production capacity, that the IRGC's answer was to widen the war geographically rather than pull back, and that the next 30 to 60 days will likely tell us which of these three paths, full escalation, negotiated de-escalation, or continued grinding attrition, actually wins out. What's certain is that this is not a self-contained news story you can watch once and move on from. It's one visible fracture point in a war that has now run longer than most 20th century regional conflicts of similar intensity involving a widening circle of countries, Kuwait, Jordan, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, that never wanted to be combatants in the first place, but are now absorbing missiles, drones, and retaliatory strikes almost daily. If you want to understand where this goes next, the things to watch are simple. Does construction activity resume at the collapsed complex in the coming weeks? Because if it does, that tells you Iran still believes it can rebuild faster than the US is willing to keep striking. Does Trump's massive attack language turn into an actual order? Because that would represent the single biggest shift of the entire 2026 phase of this war. And does the Saudi-US nuclear agreement start reshaping regional alliances in ways that further isolate Tehran diplomatically, even as it continues fighting militarily? We'll be tracking every one of those threads. Subscribe, because whichever path this takes, it's going to move fast. And we'll have it broken down the moment it happens.